Hello and welcome to today's Grand Incidents. That's right, I said incidents, plural. So far on this channel, I've dedicated entire videos to single games, but there's quite a number of Toho fan games out there on the shorter side that are still definitely worth checking out. I've had a few in mind before, but found it difficult to talk about them in a way that didn't end up being incredibly short or extremely redundant. I decided to go with an option that seemed pretty obvious from the start, going over multiple games in one video. And for my first crack at this, I'm looking over two fairly recent releases that I really enjoyed that I felt would work better as one decently length video instead of two smaller ones. That's enough on the inner machinations of my mind. Let's get into today's games, those being Hina-chan's Big Trade Millionaire Lunch and Help Me Remember Satori-sama. Starting off is Hina-chan's Big Trade Millionaire Lunch, originally released on August 28, 2021, and later released in English on Steam on January 11, 2022, by Doujin Circle ISY, and is a text-based adventure game starring Kagiyama Hina. The story here is Hina is hungry, but only has a single cucumber to her name, so she sets out on a trade quest to get something better to eat. Have you ever heard the tale of the Straw Millionaire? It's basically that. Hina can go to 6 different areas to meet up with other characters to trade with. You can also beg said characters for items to trade with, or attempt to loot their property. Every action takes a certain amount of in-game time, and you have 6 hours of it to build Hina a respectable lunch. So you start with 1 item, there's 6 characters to trade with, and around 2 to 4 tradable items in each location to grab. So how many items are there in the game total? 327. There is an insane amount of variety in this game, as some items can be given to multiple characters, which opens up a different trade route entirely. Experimentation is encouraged, and multiple playthroughs are expected. Something nice is that with each completed run, you unlock some bonus features that help with finding what works, as well as speeding up some of the repetition. Of course, I do have some issues. The biggest one is that there is only 1 track in the entire game. It's not a bad track, but it plays for everything constantly. And in a game where you're expected to play through it multiple times, you will very likely reach a point where you mute it. This at least doesn't affect the gameplay, but another issue I have here does. The options used to find new items for Hina to trade with are RNG, and that RNG is all determined on booting up the game. You could argue that's a positive if you chart out a route that grabs a lot of stuff, but it changes next time you close the game. And even then, the bigger issue I have is when working with a limited time per run, having to dedicate a chunk of it to pick up a single item to even start with becomes extremely repetitive, and sometimes even ineffective. I wish one of the bonus unlocks changed the RNG to only give you the items, as the flavor text does eventually dry up, and you're just mashing through it until you see the item window. This also makes endings a bit of a pain too. Hina has 13 endings, and which one you get is determined by either quality, quantity, or both of your items. If you're playing normally, you'll likely only ever see endings 4, 5, or 6. Some of the higher endings require a high total value, or just a ton of junk, and whether or not you can come up with the requirements rests on if you got a good RNG seed. This also slightly affects the achievements, but it's not that big a deal. My only gripe with the achievements is how few of them there are with how massive the item count is. I only got a single one of these through my entire playthrough before I started looking them up. Yeah, despite those complaints, I 100%ed this game. Why? Because I absolutely adore the character writing of this game. Even if a trade is unsuccessful, characters often comment on the specific item. And seeing those reactions, comments, and interactions with Hina over certain items has a lot of charm. I showed off items that I knew no one would trade for, simply because I wanted to see their comments on them. It's for that reason I would consider this one a rank Aya of a game, as I found the main thing that kept me coming back for more was the character writing. The gameplay loop works just fine on its own for a while, but if you lose interest in the character's reactions to new items, then you'd be very hard pressed to want to continue. Overall, Hina-chan's Big Trade Millionaire Lunch is a fun little trade game that has a few cracks in its gameplay, but tons of polish in its writing. Pretty much every negative I mentioned can be dealt with or just ignored. But if you did that without having any interest in the characters, there wouldn't be much of a point in playing. Going into the game, I expected to play 2, maybe 3 hours of it before calling it a day. But the more I saw how characters reacted to certain items, the more motivated I felt to find more items to show them, just to see what they had to say. And the end result was 100%. If you're a fan of any of the characters you see in the title screen, I think you'll have a lot of fun with this game. You may even come to like one more than you did before. I'm sure the dev would love to see more Hina fans born because of their game. As for me though, I certainly wouldn't mind more people succumbing to that sweet, sweet Jun propaganda. The next game is Help Me Remember Satori-sama, released November 27, 2021, and later in English on March 7, 2022, by the same group as the last game, ISY, and is a game of 20 questions starring Komiji Satori and her pet, Okuu. If you don't know what 20 questions is, basically, Satori asks Okuu a bunch of yes or no questions in order to figure out what she's forgotten. Satori can't just read her mind because she's exhausted from overworking herself. Simple concept, but you gotta remember who it is you're questioning. Okuu is a bit of a bird brain, and sometimes she forgets the answer to your question. There's also a chance that the answer she gives you is just wrong. Don't be too hard on her for this though, she doesn't mean to. To combat this, Satori can use a little bit of her power to confirm the correct answer. However, there is a cooldown. Answers confirmed by mind reading are in yellow, and answers that Okuu got wrong are in red. But you won't know what those are until you lose. You also get to know what the answer was upon a loss too. The final bit to mention is that sometimes Orin or Koishi will show up and distract Okuu, with Koishi being a bit more hazardous, as she clears some of your answer log out with her prank. That's the gist of the gameplay. There are a few specifics I left out though, and it kinda goes to show how much is happening in what sounds like a straightforward idea. Now for the stages. Not counting the prologue, there's 6 with an extra. Just like a mainline Toho game. Each stage is themed around something, and there's a few achievements you can get per stage. These achievements are the same for every stage though. My absolute favorite stage is that extra stage, as it's playing Guess Who with all the Toho characters between Toho 6 and 17.5. There's a lot of potential answers, so it's the stage with the highest replay value. It also exposes you as a fake fan pretty easily. Just like Hina, I 100%ed this one. Its gameplay is solid and straightforward, with a surprising amount of concepts added into it. These concepts in particular really fit the characters involved too, from Satori's partial mind reading to Oku's partial mind receding. Achievements offer replay value, and as I said, the extra stage has a lot of potential playtime to it. So now that I've listed off my positives, here comes my negatives. Even with yes or no questions, it's not always black and white. Sometimes the answer is somewhat yes, somewhat no, neutral, or even unknown. The troubles aren't the variety in answers, but more so the opinionated nature of some of them. Most questions are rooted in objectivity, but there are some that are much more subjective. It's hard to avoid a bit of personal bias in this type of game, so this is more so just a warning that you might throw yourself off, or even disagree with a given answer. There's also a bit of a culture shock to some of the responses. This isn't terribly surprising considering the dev is Japanese, so once again, this is more so just a warning. Fortunately, the translation does a good job at making the game clear for an overseas audience, and my own complaints have helped improve it even more. At least I like to think they did. Overall, Help Me Remember Satori-sama is a nice shorter game that offers a good amount of extras to keep you playing. There's a surprising amount of depth to it despite its simple explanation, and even with only 7 stages, there's a ton of potential answers throughout. I really enjoy how well the characters are portrayed in the game as mechanics, particularly with Koishi, as she really just shows up without warning, and if you aren't actively looking for her, you might not see her before it's too late. The main issues with this one mostly stem from a difference in culture, or sometimes just of opinion. But again, the translation has done well to minimize the amount of answers you get that you just wouldn't immediately think of, so it's barely considerable as a negative. I mean, there's just no way anyone would agree with every single answer Okuu gives you, unless you were the person who made this game, so you can cut the dev a little slack here. Even with it being such an easy game to understand, I'd still call this one a rank Aya of a game. The writing is good, but it's not nearly as much as a focus as Hina was, and the game mechanics still make sense even if you're unfamiliar with these characters. I do worry about poor Oku's reputation in this scenario though. So why Aya? Because with no knowledge of this series, you're gonna have a hell of a time in the extra stage. There's a lot of characters, and you will struggle with unfamiliarity. I'd say this one is an Aki rating, if not for the previous 6 stages. However, I do think the extra stage is the best part of the game, so I'm a bit torn on this rating. If you like these types of Guess Who games, then I could still recommend it. But to be blunt, I don't see your playtime being very high relative to the game's length, unless you're going into it as a fan of Toho. That's it for today's games, and the circle responsible for both of them, ISY, is still active to this day. The group's only member, Mitsusoba, is active on social media, and when they aren't posting updates on whatever game they're working on, they're drawing pictures of Hina. Well, sometimes it's not Hina, but 90% of the time it is. There's a pretty good chance that we'll see whatever they release in the future translated to English. So if you liked what you saw here, you'll be glad to know there's likely more to come. Normally, this is the part of the video where I give a rating based on knowledge required to enjoy these games fully. But I already gave my opinions on that within each game. This is the first time I'm looking into multiple games at one time, so I tried something a little different in structure. Feel free to let me know what you think of it, as I'd like to continue covering multiple smaller games like these in a similar format in the future. Hina-chan's Big Trade Millionaire Lunch and Help Me Remember Satori-sama are two games I was interested in prior to their English releases. But I didn't think I would go for 100% until I actually played them, and ended up pretty invested. Hell, I did up a whole sheet and doc for Hina-chan's trades as I played to make sure I got every interaction in the game. I do think these games are playable without Touhou knowledge, but a lot of the fun of both comes from knowing characters, so I'd only truly recommend them to Touhou fans. I'm a big fan of the devs' interpretations of characters, so I'm looking forward to future games they make. And I hope that at some point, I'll get my game starring the best character in the series, Yorigami Jun. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you during the next incident.